The high sun blazed over Astapor, bringing with it the searing heat of midday. Over the city's sprawl, the hush of anticipation lay thick. From the vantage of the great terrace of the palace, where once slavers had lorded over their chattel, Daenerys Targaryen now stood, robed in pale linens that still managed to cling to her figure in the hot wind. The dryness of the air and the occasional dust swirling through the open spaces made the environment unkind, but Daenerys's mind was fixed on greater matters. Below, the city's thoroughfares teemed with the usual bustle, freedmen going about their day, newly arrived merchants hawking exotic wares to the Valyrian troops, and Dothraki roaming in curious packs. But today, the eyes of all seemed drawn toward the harbor. There, a fleet of ships stood at anchor, not the massive war armada that had arrived with Varos, but a collection of smaller vessels bearing the flags of Yunkai and Meereen, and even some lesser city-states in the region. These ships held the last vestiges of the slaver lords, arrived under the white banners of surrender, seeking an audience with the Breaker of Chains and the fearsome new Valyrian force that backed her. It had been only a week since the monstrous display of Valyria's might had pressed Yunkai into capitulation and left Meereen trembling with the threat of an imminent siege. Surrender envoys from both cities had converged, conferring among themselves, and at last decided to present themselves in Astapor. Daenerys's messages, which promised mercy if the slavers truly dissolved their old institutions, had circulated. Now the masters came to beg for terms, for a chance to preserve their own skins if not their ancient ways. From her terrace, Daenerys caught a glimpse of Varos making his way across a nearby courtyard, his crimson and black robes billowing in the warm breeze. At his side marched several of his fire priests, their staves tipped with living flames, a sign of faith in the Lord of Light. The old city had never hosted such an assemblage of power before. The freedmen's councils, the disciplined Valyrian legionnaires, the roving Dothraki, the dragons overhead, enough to awe even the proudest of men. A shadow passed overhead, and a roar of primal energy shook the stones beneath Daenerys's feet. She looked up to see Scourge, that colossal black-scaled dragon Varos had once displayed at Winterfell, gliding in a slow arc. It was a reminder of how the face of the world had shifted. The memory of that day, when only a fraction of Varos's troops and dragons had stood revealed, paled in comparison to the reality that soared above the city now. Daenerys turned away from the ledge, hurrying down a winding staircase to the grand audience chamber where the upcoming negotiations would take place. The day's bright sunshine filtered into the hall through high windows, and torches burned at intervals, creating a play of light and shadows on the smooth stone floor. Rows of unsullied stood like statues along the edges, spears upright, perfect in their discipline. Valyrian officers lingered in small knots, quietly discussing the day's protocol. And at the far end of the chamber, a raised dais had been set with 2 seats, one for Daenerys, one for Varos. Not as thrones exactly, neither liked the implication, but as symbols of shared authority over what was to be decided this day. Jon Snow stood near the dais, clad in newly fashioned leather armor with subtle Valyrian ornamentation, his posture a blend of tension and resolve. Over the past weeks, he had grown increasingly accustomed to the swirling currents of power, torn between his background as Ned Stark's son and his place in Daenerys' circle. At his side, a pair of unsullied carried standoffish looks, though more from training than any personal mistrust. Jon's face brightened slightly when he caught sight of Daenerys entering. "They're almost here," he said quietly. "I saw their procession heading through the streets. They carry no weapons beyond ceremonial blades, from what our watchers report." Daenerys nodded, taking a seat on the edge of the dais before the formalities began. "They must know they have no chance at subterfuge here, not with so many legionnaires and dragons about." Jon gave a mild shrug. "Desperation can lead men to foolish gambles." She sighed, recalling the blood that might be shed if these masters tried anything. "We'll be vigilant, but hopefully they've come to bend the knee for real." Moments later, Varos arrived, descending from a side corridor with quiet grace. He acknowledged Jon with a fleeting nod, then turned to Daenerys. "Are we ready for them?" "We are," Daenerys said, settling her nerves. I only hope they accept their new reality without forcing our hand. Varos's gaze glinted with a confidence born of prophecy. They will. The Lord of Light's flame has shown me the threads. Slaver's Bay is ours, whether they bow with grace or in chains. Jon tensed at the remark but held his tongue, remembering how far they had come. Arguing with Varos at such a critical juncture would do little good. Instead, he moved to stand just behind and to the side of Daenerys' seat. The posture was one of support and caution, his hand near the hilt of the sword slung across his back. Soon, trumpets sounded from the hall outside, echoing across the chamber walls. A hush fell, and all eyes turned toward the great wooden doors. With a resounding creak, they opened to reveal a retinue of men in rich silks and gold ornaments, the slave masters from Yunkai, Meereen, and several lesser city-states. Their clothing and jewelry sparkled, but their faces bore the unmistakable pallor of fear. At the forefront stood men with haughty demeanors, though their posture betrayed tension. Some wore the bands marking them as high-status owners of once powerful dynasties. Yet all that power seemed fragile now in the presence of so many dragons and so much soldierly might. An officer of the Unsullied commanded them to halt a respectable distance from the dais. They complied, forming a rough semicircle. The hush that fell over the chamber was profound, as though the air itself waited for the confrontation to begin. Daenerys rose, moving to stand front and center. Her voice carried across the chamber with clarity, honed by experience in commanding men and addressing crowds. "Lords of Yunkai, Meereen, and beyond," she began. "You have sought audience here in Astapor with me, Daenerys Targaryen, and with Varos, commander of the Valyrian host. We welcome you under truce, so you may speak your terms of surrender." Murmurs rippled through the group. A tall man, silver-haired and gaunt, stepped forward, presumably one of Meereen's ruling class. His voice trembled ever so slightly. "Your Grace, we come to discuss a peaceful resolution, a path that spares our cities the destruction wrought by dragons. We acknowledge your ascendancy in these lands." Daenerys inclined her head. "Ascendancy is a mild term for what we have displayed. But yes, we aim to free every slave in Slaver's Bay and end the master's tyranny. If you vow to abolish all forms of slavery, set your slaves free, and accept the governance we put in place, you may keep your lives, your families, and some measure of local authority, under oversight, of course." Another lord, wearing the heavy golden torque of Yunkai, wrung his hands as he spoke. "We have seen the might of your dragons, your armies, your unstoppable force. We see little choice but to obey. But how do we ensure our safety once we relinquish all our property, all the wealth we built on the old ways?" Varos stepped forward, exuding that calm, almost chilling presence. "Your lives will be spared if you cooperate. As for wealth, money gleaned from cruel practices must be relinquished. We are not here to reward your sins but to allow you a chance at redemption. The new Valyrian order is merciful to those who bend willingly, but pitiless to defiance. Make your choice carefully." An uneasy silence followed. Several among the master's retinue exchanged glances, measuring the mood in the chamber. The words mercy and pitiless hung in the air like twin fates, and they knew which side they'd prefer. One of the older masters cleared his throat. We choose mercy, then, for ourselves, for our families. The slaves can be freed, the markets closed, the old systems dismantled. We shall comply." A visible slump of collective shoulders told Daenerys the fear of being burned alive by dragons had indeed broken these men more effectively than any negotiation might have. She suppressed a flicker of relief. If they were genuine, war might be averted. But cynicism, taught by her experiences in Astapor and Yunkai, reminded her that words were cheap among slavers. She refused to show that doubt openly. Jon observed from behind, reading the tension in each master's eyes. Their fear was real enough, but fear could breed treachery if unchecked. He recalled Varos's earlier comment that once Slaver's Bay was under their banner, the next step might be subduing the free cities that refused to renounce slavery. And after that, the letters to Westeros, the precarious attempt to keep King Robert from panicking. It all felt like a powder keg. Still, for now, at least the slaver lords were conceding. Daenerys motioned to a group of scribes waiting along the periphery. "We have prepared documents of capitulation. Each city's representatives must sign, pledging an end to slave ownership and the right of freedmen's councils to partake in governance. You will, however, be allowed some local authority, conditional upon your abiding by these new laws. If any city is discovered to continue the practice of slavery or revert to old customs, our retribution will be swift and final." Several scribes came forward, presenting quills and parchment. The slaver lords took up the quills with unsteady hands. The hush in the chamber grew almost suffocating. Their signatures upon these documents marked the end of generations of tradition that had enriched them. But with the monstrous might arrayed against them, they had no illusions about defying the Targaryen queen and her Valyrian ally. The scratching of quills was a small, poignant sound echoing off the stone walls, amplified by the stillness of so many watchers. As each master signed, he stepped back, lowering his gaze in a sign of reluctant submission. One by one, they completed this humiliating ritual, and soon the scribes confirmed that every major city in Slaver's Bay had officially, if not wholeheartedly, bent the knee. A swift sense of finality pervaded the hall, and yet Daenerys's posture remained poised, Varos's expression unwavering. There was one last question to settle: what to do with the thousands of newly freed men and women, and how to incorporate them into the new Valyrian order. Varos addressed the masters, though his real audience was the entire region. "Henceforth, Slaver's Bay is no more. The name itself shall be abolished, replaced by a new administrative structure under Daenerys Targaryen's guidance. Freedmen will be given the chance to join the growing host if they wish, the Valyrian legions that stand as protectors of this reborn land. Or they may remain in their cities, forging new lives without chains." The mention of the Valyrian legions caught the attention of many in the chamber. It was no secret that Varos had arrived with a force numbering over 100,000, and that the best of them had been stationed in Astapor, yet even more were rumored to be en route or hidden across Essos. Now they intended to add local freedmen to their ranks? The potential manpower was dizzying, enough to rival entire continents. Daenerys nodded in support, turning her gaze to the assembled masters. "We will allow you to remain as advisors in your cities if you prove loyal to the cause of freedom. If you cling to the old ways, your seat of power will be removed, and freedmen's councils will rule without you. Choose wisely. Redemption is possible, but we will not hesitate to root out betrayal." A hush followed, broken only by the quiet shuffling of feet. The lines had been drawn. Each lord offered subdued acquiescence. There was no alternative, and they knew it. They had come here to surrender, and surrender they did. At that, Varos lifted a hand, gesturing to the scribes. "Your signatures seal the pacts. Henceforth, your peoples are to be recognized as free. The Lord of Light's blessings upon those who walk the path of righteousness. Our soldiers will accompany you back, ensuring you implement these changes." That closed the official portion of the assembly. The slaver lords bowed and departed, ushered by the unsullied out into the scorching midday sun. They would likely begin their journeys home soon, some by ship, others by caravans across the desert. Daenerys hoped none would act rashly. A single betrayal might spark an example that the new Valyria was not merciful to oathbreakers. With the hall emptying, Daenerys and Varos retired to a smaller antechamber at the side, where Jon Snow lingered. The day had only begun, and already the weight of decisions made felt monumental. The freedmen of Yunkai and Meereen would now flood into the new order, some to remain in their cities, others perhaps eager to serve in the Grand Legions Varos championed. The forging of this legion from local populations, from former slaves, from Dothraki outriders, from the disciplined Valyrian ranks, Daenerys could barely imagine the scope. It was a juggernaut, unstoppable if unified in purpose. Jon's voice broke the silence. "It's done then. The old masters have signed away their power. But can we trust them to uphold it once they reach their cities? Or might they try to conspire in secret?" Varos, lighting a small brazier with a gesture of his palm, some trick akin to a fire priest's skill, spoke calmly. "They know the consequences of defiance. the dragons overhead, the legions at their gates. Fear is a potent teacher. Coupled with your freedmen's counsels, it will ensure compliance. Daenerys folded her arms, eyes reflecting her cautious hope. We must remain vigilant. Any sign of them reverting to slavery must be crushed swiftly. But for now, we must also begin the process of incorporating these freed slaves who want to serve. We can't just enroll them blindly into the legions without structure. We need training, discipline, a chain of command. Jon nodded. I can help with that. I saw the Unsullied's training. We can replicate an adapted version, though less brutal, I hope. Varos's gaze flickered with approval. Indeed, a more humane model. The old Valyria we build cannot rely on the horrors of the past. The freedmen will want a stake in their future. A legion that welcomes them, trains them in modern warfare, pays them wages. That is how loyalty is forged. Just then, one of Daenerys's Unsullied stepped into the chamber, announcing that the day's next matter awaited. The arrival of the first groups of volunteers from Yunkai and Astapor, former slaves seeking to join the Valyrian legions. Daenerys took a breath, exchanging a glance with Varos. The project commenced sooner than expected, yet it was a vital step in consolidating power. The group moved through torchlit corridors to a wide courtyard that had been repurposed for training. There, dozens of men and women, clad in simple garments, stood in uncertain lines under the watchful eye of a handful of Valyrian officers. Their faces showed a mix of determination, awe, and fear. These freedmen, once property, now yearned for respect, purpose, and the chance to ensure no tyrant enslaved them again. Daenerys took the lead, stepping onto a small platform. In a clear, carrying voice, she said, "You who stand here as free souls have chosen to join our legions. The path you walk will not be easy. You will train in discipline, in weaponry, in loyalty to a new order that rejects the old evils. Do so with honor, and you will be part of the greatest force this world has seen in centuries." The freedmen listened intently, some with tears in their eyes at the mere concept of forging a new destiny with the very men who had freed them. Valyrian captains, each bearing the stylized draconic insignia, marched among them, evaluating posture, health, willingness to learn. These men and women would be integrated into squads, taught the basics of formation, armed with spears or swords. Over time, they might become a mirror of the fabled legions of old Valyria, though shaped by the moral convictions Daenerys brought, tempered by the discipline Varos demanded, and perhaps guided by the empathy Jon championed. After a brief inspection, the freedmen were dismissed to receive initial instructions on living quarters, daily rations, and basic orientation to the new chain of command. Daenerys stepped away, heart brimming with a combination of pride and trepidation. If this worked, the population of Slavers Bay might soon be forging the backbone of a realm unstoppable in might. Later that same day, Jon Snow found himself in a portion of the city adapted into a large pen for dragons. The original plan had been to keep Daenerys' 3 dragons separate from Varos's fearsome brood, but with so many now present in Astapor, space and practicality demanded some integration. Particularly, the question lingered whether Drogon, the fiercest of Daenerys' trio, could coexist with Scourge, Varos's colossal draconic champion. Up until now, the beasts had mostly stayed in separate corners, with minimal interaction besides passing roars in the sky. But Jon hoped to see if they could begin forging a bond of acceptance, if not friendship. The illusions of controlling such creatures were fragile, after all. The pit was a wide courtyard walled off with high stone, reinforced by newly erected ramparts. Tapestries of scorch marks marred its surfaces, a testament to the test flights and the occasional outburst of dragonfire from smaller beasts. Today, the pit's gates were open to allow Scourge to enter from one side and Drogon from another, each accompanied by a rider or handler. Varos would handle Scourge. Jon Snow would ride Drogon. Daenerys had suggested this might be safer than letting both dragons roam free, considering the hostility that might spark otherwise. Jon stood at Drogon's flank, carefully running his hand along the dragon's black scales. Drogon huffed, exhaling warm breath that smelled faintly of sulfur. The bond between them had grown after many flights, guided by Daenerys' instructions. But Drogon remained unpredictable, a mirror of Daenerys' own fiery will. Jon whispered a calming phrase as he swung onto the dragon's back, an act that still filled him with cautious wonder. Once mounted, he gave a light nudge with his legs, coaxing Drogon into a slow loping gait across the pit's sandy floor. Meanwhile, Varos entered astride Scourge, the difference in size startling. Maelstrom was mightiest of all, but Scourge surpassed any normal concept of large. His red-black hide gleamed in the sunlight, each scale an armor plate that might defy siege weaponry. The thunderous sound of his breathing sent small vibrations through the ground. Though Varos rode him with uncanny ease, one might suspect only the Lord of Light's chosen could maintain such mastery. The two dragons approached each other, Drogon bristling with tension, emitting a low growl that rumbled through the pit. Scourge arched his massive neck, peering down at the smaller black dragon with something akin to curiosity or contempt. For a moment, Jon feared a violent outbreak, but he kept a firm hand on Drogon's spines, quietly murmuring soothing words. Both beasts hissed, exchanging staccato roars that reverberated off the walls. Onlookers, unsullied guards, a few Valyrian officers, remained at the edges, prepared to flee if the situation turned dangerous. Varos lifted a palm, channeling some form of psychic calm, or so Jon guessed by the subtle shift in Scourge's posture. The massive dragon ceased the display of aggression, lowering his horned head in a slow, almost wary motion. Drogon likewise stilled, only flicking his barbed tail in agitation. Then, with a sudden motion, both dragons unleashed a brief spurt of flame into the air above them, like an exchange of draconic greetings. The combined heat flared white-hot, well above the watchers. Jon felt the wave of intense warmth wash over him, but neither rider nor watchers panicked. It did not appear to be an act of hostility, rather a demonstration, like two great predators testing boundaries without fatal outcome. Varos's voice rang out, echoing in the pit. "Steady, Scourge. This is Drogon, worthy kin. Let the bond of fire unite us rather than force us apart." He guided the dragon forward a few more steps, bringing the beasts nearly flank to flank. Their towering forms overshadowed Jon, who sat tensely on Drogon's back, uncertain if trust was warranted. In the hush that followed, the dragons sniffed each other with caution, exhaling heated breaths. Drogon snapped the air near Scourge's muzzle, a quick, half-hearted snap, eliciting only a soft hiss from the bigger beast. Then, an almost startling calm fell between them, as if, in that moment, they recognized they were not foes, but kin separated by circumstance. Their roars ebbed, replaced by low, rumbling calls reminiscent of domesticated creatures acknowledging a mutual closeness. Jon, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, marveled at the display. Two dragons of formidable power, forging a tentative acceptance. He looked across to Varos, who wore a faint smile of satisfaction. The Lord of Light, it seemed, had blessed this meeting. Daenerys, watching from a high vantage, could hardly contain her relief. If Drogon and Scourge tolerated each other, then the synergy of their draconic might grew even further, a sign that the forging of a new Valyria, with multiple dragons in alignment, might truly be unstoppable. At last, Jon guided Drogon in a wide arc, stepping away from Scourge, letting the tension ease. Varos did similarly. The watchers dared to breathe again, and a murmur of awe rippled through the pit. For the time being, at least, conflict between these two apex predators was averted, replaced by an uneasy but real truce. The significance was not lost on anyone. If the heirs of two different lines of Targaryen or Valyrian legacy could unify their dragons, the path to forging a new empire in the east was all the more certain. Days later, Daenerys convened another high assembly in the palace. Now that all the major slaver lords had surrendered, she wished to set in motion the broad plan for incorporating the freed populations into the Valyrian legions. The freedmen, numbering in the tens of thousands, had swarmed from Yunkai and Meereen to Astapor's gates, seeking the banner of protection and the promise of a purpose. Skilled artisans, farmers, and laborers also arrived, hoping to contribute to this new society that promised them dignity. Varos, standing at Daenerys' side, outlined the organizational structure in calm, precise terms. Each city would maintain a freedmen's council, but those who wished to join the legions would be enrolled in training camps. The training would blend the tested discipline of the Unsullied with the martial traditions gleaned from Varos's Valyrian force. Officers from each culture, Dothraki, freedmen, Old Valyrian, would be integrated to create a sense of shared mission. This legion would not be a mere rabble. It would be an army shaped by the moral imperative of ending slavery, hardened by the unstoppable might of dragons, and guided by the divine illusions of the Lord of Light. At least so said the priests in hushed, reverent tones. Jon, present at this meeting, raised a hand to interject. We must ensure these freedmen understand the responsibilities that come with such power. We can't have newly freed people turning into oppressors themselves or succumbing to unchecked zeal. Daenerys nodded firmly. Agreed. Our cause is liberation, not vengeance. The old slavers see us as conquerors, but we must show them that our power is used to protect the weak, not enslave them anew. Varos placed a scroll on the table. I've drawn up a basic code of conduct for the Legion. No soldier shall mistreat civilians. Punishments for any sign of re-enslavement or tyranny will be severe. The Lord of Light's flame, after all, spares no guilt. He said the last phrase with a cryptic finality that caused a slight chill to pass through the room. Daenerys studied him, then turned to her captains. We will distribute these codes in the local tongues, ensuring every recruit understands them before they swear their oaths. If we are to replace the old system, we must do better. The administrative tasks stretched on for hours, detailed allocations of rations, the building of new barracks, the forging of arms and armor. The city's forges burned night and day. The day ended with a sense of momentum, an unstoppable tide forging a new political entity in Slaver's Bay. A realm free of chains, bound instead by the iron discipline of a Valyrian legion and the watchful eyes of dragons overhead. Weeks passed in relative calm. Astapor flourished under this infusion of order and resources. The freedmen's councils took shape in Yunkai, and from Meereen, early reports suggested uneasy compliance as they dismantled slave markets. Daenerys and Varos awaited word from King's Landing, whether Robert had received their envoy and decided to treat them as a threat or remain neutral. Nothing definitive arrived, though scattered rumors suggested the envoy had landed near the Blackwater. If so, the crown might still be deliberating. The slight lull in immediate conflict allowed Daenerys to travel among her new territory. She visited Yunkai's disbanded fighting pits, speaking with freedmen who once suffered under the master's cruelty. She soared above the desert on the back of one of her smaller dragons, regal, accompanied by a retinue of unsullied riding swift horses below. In each town or village, she listened to the people's stories, encouraging them to see the new order not as another yoke but a shield. Meanwhile, Varos oversaw expansions in the coastal forts, ensuring any approach by sea could be repelled. The entire bay, once a stronghold of slaver wealth, braced for the future as a nucleus of this new Valyrian power. During one such day, Daenerys returned to Astapor to find a swirl of excitement in the palace. Jon greeted her with a relieved expression, explaining that a raven had arrived, though not from Westeros. It bore the seal of Bravos, carrying a courteously worded letter that politely reaffirmed the city's neutrality but also inquired about the possibility of trade with Daenerys' regime. This hint of acceptance from Bravos was encouraging, suggesting that at least one major free city wasn't jumping into an alliance with Robert out of fear. Perhaps the envoy's mission to King's Landing had succeeded in easing tensions, or Bravos simply saw opportunities in commerce. Either way, it was a small but crucial sign that forging the new empire didn't necessarily mean a cataclysmic war across the sea. Yet not all was seamless. Rumors of disquiet among certain red priests circulated. Some, it seemed, were more extreme in their interpretations of the Lord of Light's visions. They whispered that Westeros, too, would need purification, and that the bastion of old houses had no place in the new dawn. Daenerys heard these rumors with growing concern. The last thing she needed was to provoke Robert by letting these extremist voices overshadow the official stance. Varos, on hearing such rumors, assured her that while the priests were passionate, they followed his guidance. Still, the seeds of fanaticism were planted in the hearts of men and women who had tasted the power of dragons. Daenerys recognized the risk of letting that flame burn unchecked. Meanwhile, Oberyn, though he remained absent from this retelling by user request, could have contributed insights. But in his absence from the text, the focus tightened on how Daenerys, Varos, Jon, and the Freedmen's Councils shaped the ongoing saga. After months of transformative changes, the swirl of events led to a culminating day in Astapor where the last wave of slaver lords from minor city-states arrived to sign their surrender. The Freedmen's Councils officially took full governance in Yunkai, with Meereen poised to follow. Rows of new Legion recruits assembled for inspection, some wearing newly forged plate or mail, others still clad in the simpler garb of freedmen but holding spears with pride. Daenerys, accompanied by Varos, walked among them, speaking words of encouragement. At a vantage point overlooking this muster, Jon stood with Drogon perched not far away. The black dragon observed the crowd with bright, watchful eyes, occasionally snorting a puff of flame as if eager to prove dominance. Nearby, at the city's outskirts, Scourge lurked, overshadowing entire blocks with his monstrous wings. Yet no violence marked the day, only the hum of purposeful activity. The masters who had resisted were no more, and the rest had yielded to the unstoppable tide. Slaver's Bay, once a realm of cruelty and despair, now pulsed with the energy of a new civilization forming under the banner of Old Valyria and the cause of freedom. As the midday sun reached its peak, a hush fell over the gathering in the main square. A herald announced the arrival of Varos and Daenerys, who took a central raised platform. A sea of freedmen, legionnaires, and watchers from other cities parted to let them pass. Overhead, a small flight of dragons circled, underscoring the might that secured such dramatic change. Varos spoke first, his voice carrying with peculiar intensity. People of Astapor, Yunkai, Meereen, and beyond, your chains are broken. The Lord of Light's flame has guided us to this victory over those who would keep you in bondage. Now we stand at the threshold of a new age, an age of liberty tempered by discipline, an age of dragons leading humanity to greatness. This is the dawn of the new Valyria, an empire forged from the ashes of cruelty. A rousing cheer erupted. Freedmen shouted in triumph. The legionnaires banged spears on the ground in unison. Daenerys then addressed them, gentler in tone but no less firm. We have taken these cities not to subjugate but to liberate. In unity, we will ensure that no master can ever again rise to break your spirits or chain your children. As we incorporate the population of Slaver's Bay, you will have the choice to serve in the legions or live freely in your cities, governed by councils of your own choosing, so long as you uphold the laws that protect everyone's freedom. This day marks the rebirth of a realm without chains, guided by the might of dragons, yes, but also by the hope of a better world. Roaring applause followed. Many knelt, not in subservience but in reverence for the moment, tears streaking cheeks that once belonged to the oppressed. Valyrian officers signaled for the new recruits to step forward, each group bearing the banner of their city, each prepared to swear oaths to the new order. Jon watched from the side, arms folded over his chest, an unusual mixture of pride and anxiety in his stance. He recognized that while the immediate goal was noble, ending slavery on a massive scale, he could not ignore the quiet storm that might loom if Westeros refused to accept this empire's rise. Yet for today, he allowed himself a measure of satisfaction at the justice delivered to these once downtrodden souls. As the oath-taking ceremony commenced, the crowd recited lines about defending freedom, obeying the rightful commands of Daenerys and Varos, and honoring the flame of the Lord of Light that guided their unity. An echo of fervor passed through the ranks, reminiscent of old religious rites, but with a distinctly new purpose. Drums rolled. A chorus sang an anthem in High Valyrian. The synergy of warlike readiness and moral crusade created a heady atmosphere, one that Daenerys hoped would remain anchored in compassion rather than slip into fanatic conquest. Afterwards, as the crowd dispersed to celebrate or tend to duties, Daenerys and Varos withdrew to the palace. Jon joined them and they convened in a small council room, where a table displayed updated maps of the region. Meereen stood highlighted as a city that had largely capitulated in principle, though certain segments of its population might still need direct persuasion. The discourse turned toward questions of governance: how to finalize freedmen's councils, how to structure the chain of command for the integrated legion, how to keep an eye on the Red Priests who preached an even broader expansion. Night fell by the time they concluded these discussions. The hum of lively gatherings outside in Astapor's squares hinted at ongoing celebrations. Freed slaves danced, feasted, and reveled in the knowledge that their once oppressors had publicly surrendered. The new age felt tangible even if wariness persisted about the future. Varos parted with a cryptic comment that the next step after Slavers Bay might be forging alliances or imposing demands upon the free cities. But that, he said, would depend on how they responded to the title shift. And if they, too, refused to abandon slavery or recognized the threat that a new Valyria posed, conflict might spark anew. Jon listened, not quite intervening. He thought about the possibility of returning to Westeros one day to explain all this to Ned, to reason with Robert. Could the Seven Kingdoms accept an empire of dragons rising across the sea that did not turn its gaze westward for conquest? Perhaps, if the envoy and subsequent letters cooled tensions. Or perhaps not. He felt the weight of each unknown pressing on him, yet also recognized that at least here and now, people who had once suffered under chains were free. In the subsequent days, the newly inducted freedmen recruits began basic training. Under the watchful eyes of Valyrian officers, they practiced formation drills, learned standard commands in High Valyrian, and were issued standard gear. Though many had the wide-eyed wonder of novices, they displayed a zeal that sprang from the gratitude of being part of something greater than themselves. Daenerys and Varos remained in Astapor for this foundational period, ensuring the plan to incorporate Slavers Bay's population proceeded smoothly. The Freedmen's Councils oversaw civil affairs, with each city's rebellious masters kept on a tight leash, their potential for sabotage stifled by the omnipresent threat of dragons. Meereen's final submission progressed without open battle, quelling Daenerys' fears of widespread bloodshed. She heard reports of old fighting pits being shut down, high-born slavers humbling themselves in freedmen assemblies, and large waves of freed men and women seeking a new path. Between coordinating these massive changes, Daenerys found moments to fly Drogon alongside the other dragons, forging what she hoped would become an unbreakable bond among the draconic brood. Jon accompanied her on certain flights, though he often used Regal or Viserion, sometimes even riding double with Daenerys if the situation demanded. Meanwhile, Varos soared overhead on Scourge, each flight a demonstration of synergy that left watchers breathless. The chorus of roars weaving through the skies became a daily spectacle in Astapor, a reminder that the New World Order was guarded by living gods of flame. At length, a new tension mounted. Spies returning from the coasts muttered about a wave of foreign ships in the southern seas. Some said they carried envoys from the free cities, come to ascertain the truth of the new empire. Others feared potential threats. Varos ordered vigilant patrols, determined not to let any rival sabotage their newborn empire from the shadows. Yet a calmer rumor also circulated, that a raven from Westeros was en route, carrying King Robert's formal reply. The next steps between Essos and Westeros would hang on that letter, whether acceptance or condemnation. Daenerys waited, heart unsettled. She wanted peace, for now, though she knew the wheel often spun in violent arcs. One twilight, as the sun bled crimson over the desert skyline, Daenerys reflected upon the unstoppable changes they had wrought. The entire population of Slavers Bay, once nearly enslaved from coast to city, now stood on the cusp of joining an empire built on ideals of liberation and orchestrated by Valyrian might. Thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, if one included the families and local supporters, merged into the legion or contributed to new governance. The old houses of cruelty lay decimated, their survivors co-opted into administrative roles under watchful eyes. Jon, standing at her side on a narrow palace balcony, breathed in the cooling air. He faced her with a quiet intensity. "You've done it, Daenerys. Slavers Bay is no more." She nodded slowly, scanning the lit streets below. Yes, but it's only the beginning. In a sense, the real test comes next, forging this region into a stable society, preparing for whatever stands beyond. Whether that is the free cities or Westeros. Jon's gaze reflected an inner storm. I know. If the letter from Robert arrives soon, we'll see if we can avoid a greater war. Then he gently touched her hand in a rare, tender gesture. Whatever happens, you've changed countless lives for the better. A small, grateful smile curved Daenerys's lips. We both have, and Varos, for all his ominous zeal, gave us the dragons, the legions, the means to do it. I only pray it does not devour us, that we do not become what we once fought. The swirl of doubt and hope laced her words, a reflection of her never-ending internal struggle. She stepped away from Jon, returning her gaze to the city, to the thousands forging a new dawn. Flames flickered across the towers, an echo of the unstoppable flame that had remade the East. Now, the combined might of newly freed populations, legions of disciplined soldiers, and a brood of dragons overshadowed any power base the old world had known in centuries. The day might come when they tested Westeros's resolve. But for tonight, the newly reborn Slavers' Bay glimmered with a sense of triumph. Down in the streets, freedmen's councils held meetings by torchlight, shaping local laws. In the training yards, recruits hammered away at wooden dummies, forging the discipline that would one day lend them the name Valyrian legionnaires. And above all, dragons soared, black silhouettes against the dimming sky, occasionally letting out triumphant roars that resonated through the city. Some roars were from small ones that Daenerys had raised, others from Varos's older stock, including the monstrous forms of Maelstrom and Scourge. Their flight patterns weaved a tapestry of fire and darkness that dazzled the eyes. The night eventually settled over the city, the last echoes of roars fading into the hush of Astapor's repose. At the palace, Daenerys, Varos, and Jon parted ways, each weighed by their own questions. The region's fate, newly sealed by the mass surrender of slavers and the incorporation of freedmen into the legions, lay firmly in their hands. Yet the path forward bristled with uncertain challenges: negotiations with the free cities, cautionary ties with Westeros, and the simmering zeal of those who believed the entire world should bow to the new Valyria. For now, however, Slavers' Bay was free, and the lords of old had laid down their whips in exchange for the tenuous mercy of a queen with dragons and a sorcerer who spoke for a god of flame. As Daenerys retreated to her private chambers, she allowed herself a moment of weary satisfaction. The slaver lords had come, they had bent the knee, they had signed away their vile practices. Tens of thousands of freedmen would no longer wake in chains at dawn, subject to lash and cruelty. And the dragons soared, guardians of a cause that, despite all the moral complexities, bristled with righteous purpose. From a single vantage, it seemed a triumph unmatched in ages. Yet, in the labyrinth of her mind, she remembered how fragile victory could be. The White Walkers had once threatened to end all life, until their defeat. Now, men threatened to tear each other apart in a new era. The swirl of politics, the looming specter of Westeros, the question of how far the priests of R'hllor would push their crusade. It all spelled possibilities of conflict not yet realized. For now, though, Daenerys clung to the night's calm, inhaled the desert breeze, and prayed that when the letters from King's Landing finally came, they would not bring tidings of another unstoppable war. Thus, the scene ended with a hush over the newly minted empire. The slavers had surrendered in Astapor, their final grip on Slavers' Bay shattered. The freedmen's integration into the Valyrian legions began in earnest. Drogon and Scourge accepted each other's presence without unleashing devastation. Varos's grand plan moved apace, each step forging a continent no longer shackled by the old horrors. The dawn of a new Valyria continued to grow, overshadowing the old order with the unstoppable force of dragons and the fervor of the Lord of Light's flame. And in the star-filled sky above Astapor, one could almost sense fate weaving the threads, setting the stage for whatever lay beyond the desert's edge and across the moody sea. Only time would reveal if peace or war awaited, but for this moment, at least, fire and freedom triumphed in Slavers' Bay. Daenerys had summoned her council in the Grand Hall of Astapor, a hall once occupied by slave masters whose whips and cruelty had shaped these walls, now repurposed for the forging of a new age. Flames from tall braziers flickered against columns of sandstone, casting shifting shadows on faces that bore the weight of momentous choices. Gathered around a long table of polished wood were those who had shared in her struggles, her conquests, her triumphs, and her losses. Valyrian officers mingled with unsullied captains, Dothraki bloodriders leaned casually near the walls, and freedmen's representatives from Yunkai, Meereen, and Astapor stood in humble attendance. Many had witnessed both liberation and violence in the name of freedom. Varos arrived in a swirl of crimson robes, the Lord of Light symbol woven across his chest in black thread, signifying the presence of R'hllor. His fiery eyes took in the assembled crowd, flicked over Daenerys in silent greeting, and lingered on the one figure who looked slightly uncomfortable amid all the pomp, Jon Snow. Though he wore new leathers dyed in deep red and black, Jon kept the stark dirk at his belt, a reminder of the past he carried within him. He stood quietly, one hand at rest near the hilt, scanning the chamber for any signs of conflict. Not far from him, a handful of red priests murmured incantations under their breath, repeating prayers Daenerys could sometimes barely translate. Their faith had grown bolder with each victory, each city freed, each master made to bend the knee. Daenerys herself sat at the head of the table, wearing a pale tunic of thick cloth that breathed in the desert heat. The scars of her early struggles were not visible on her flesh but lay etched in her mind. Memories of crossing the Red Waste, of hatching the first 3 dragons, of forging alliances in the face of unimaginable foes. She thought often of the moment so many months before, when she had fought at Winterfell against the Night King, allying with Jon and the armies of the North and the Southern Lords. The memory of that battle still haunted the realm, and not a day passed without someone mentioning it. There had been a time when the dead threatened to devour all living creatures, only to be turned back by the synergy of dragons, men, and courage. Now, in the hush of this hall, it felt like a different lifetime. When Daenerys rose to speak, the rustle of movement ceased. She was not on a throne here but stood at the table's edge, meeting the eyes of every face in the chamber. "We have gathered to reflect on what we've built and the challenges that lie before us," she began, her voice carrying across the hush. "Slaver's Bay stands freed, its chains shattered, its old masters either subdued or coerced into new ways. This morning, I received final confirmation that Meereen's rebellious elements have accepted our rule, that Yunkai's Freedmen's Council is forming a stable governance, and that Astapor, our stronghold, continues to be the heart of this new Valyria." She paused, letting the significance sink in. But there is more to discuss. The question of expansion the new dragons Varos has brought from old Valyria, and the recent memories we all share of the battle against the Night King. What we do next will shape continents. The mention of the Night King brought a ripple of tension, as though a cold wind had passed through. The memory of that clash in the snowy darkness of the north lingered with many in this room. A handful of Unsullied had fought there. Jon Snow, of course, had been central to the cause, and Varos had contributed a fraction of his forces at the time, a token force that, in hindsight, was so vast even then that it seemed unbelievable it had only been a taste of what he commanded. The recollection of that battle was not simply a memory of horror but also a warning that forces beyond mortal squabbles could arise, and Daenerys could see that knowledge glimmering in the eyes of her council. Varos inclined his head, stepping into the circle of attention. "Essos stands on the brink of complete liberation. Our efforts in Slaver's Bay have proven unstoppable, thanks to the might of dragons, the discipline of our new Valyrian legions, and the rightful claim Daenerys Targaryen wields. Yet whispers persist of alliances forming among the free cities, alliances built on fear that we may someday turn our eyes upon them. Meanwhile, Westeros, under King Robert Baratheon, remains uncertain. We have sent envoys to assure him we do not plan invasion, at least not now." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But we cannot ignore that the Lords of Light have shown me many possible paths. One leads to confrontation with the Seven Kingdoms if they do not remain at arm's length." A silent exchange passed between Varos and Jon. Jon's face betrayed his inner struggle. Though he had pledged himself to Daenerys' cause, the ties of his northern heritage and the memory of Ned Stark's moral compass weighed upon him. Daenerys observed this, conscious that tensions between East and West might force Jon to choose sides. She quickly spoke again, hoping to navigate the conversation. Varys is correct. We remain watchful regarding Westeros. We do not wish war with Robert Baratheon, especially after we all faced the Night King together. This council is also about acknowledging that victory over the White Walkers and how it shapes the trust or distrust that Westeros holds toward us. Many in the Seven Kingdoms are grateful for our role. Others, like Robert, remain cautious, perhaps resentful, that Targaryens and Valyrians rose to overshadow them once more. One of the freedmen representatives from Yunkai, a lean man wearing a simple linen tunic, raised his voice. Your Grace, if Westeros stands aside, does that mean we can focus our resources on forging deeper stability here? The slaves are freed, but many still need homes, trades, a sense of belonging. Our councils are overwhelmed by the needs of the people. Might we consider forging new farmland, or? Varys responded gently, though with steel behind his words. Resources to rebuild, to feed, to arm, shall be allocated. The new Valyrian legions will integrate freedmen swiftly, offering a structured life and pay. We are not merely toppling old ways. We are creating a new society. Astapor is the center, but soon it may not suffice to hold all the administrative tasks. We will need stable councils in Yunkai and Meereen. In time, perhaps, we can even place freedmen's councils in the free cities, if they choose to embrace this new dawn. A murmur of approval passed through the freedmen's delegates, though many also exchanged uncertain looks. Even as they embraced the ideals, there was fear about expansion, about war, about what a full Valyrian empire would entail. Daenerys noted that fear and sought to temper it. If war can be avoided, we will avoid it. But we must remain vigilant. The days of complacency, of letting slavers rebuild in the shadows, are gone. We have dragons to guard our skies and a legion to guard our roads. No corner of Slaver's Bay shall revert to the old ways. Jon stepped forward quietly. About these new dragons, Your Grace. We have dozens now in Astapor alone, some dwarfed by the likes of Drogon or Maelstrom, but others still formidable. The city is already straining to house them. If we expand further, we must consider how to contain and feed such a brood. Not to mention the tension it causes among local populations, seeing so many enormous beasts overhead. Daenerys nodded, recalling the countless times freedmen had quaked at the roars in the night. We have designated additional pens outside Yunkai's walls, and some can roost amid the desert canyons. A rotation might keep them from crowding one city. As for feeding them, hunts in the deserts can provide partial sustenance, though we must ensure we do not strip the land bare. Varys, you mentioned a plan to use certain coastal waters for fishing. Yes. Varys inclined his head. Dragons are versatile hunters, but yes, we'll supplement with fish from our newly built fleets. The priests also speak of forging symbiotic connections between dragons and land. Once we push further east, farmland could be shaped to produce livestock in abundance. The scale of old Valyria's might always required massive resources, and we intend to replicate that. Astapor, though a start, cannot hold everything. Over time, we may see Meereen's farmland repurposed to raise herds specifically for dragons. A swirl of quiet conversation followed. Some freedmen remained wide-eyed at the idea of taming entire swathes of Essos for dragon feeding. Others saw it as an inevitable necessity if the empire was to flourish. Daenerys picked up the mention of over time from Varys's remark, understanding that they stood only at the beginning of a project that might last years, even generations. A pang of longing for a simpler destiny rose within her, but she set it aside. Her sense of duty to break chains, to forge a realm where innocence thrived, pushed her onward. Another freedman, this one from Meereen, approached the table. Your Grace, if we might speak of how we incorporate these freedmen into the Legion. Many still bear emotional scars from fighting. The Unsullied themselves were once trained in cruelty. Are we sure we can unify these different training methods without conflict? Daenerys looked at Jon, inviting him to address the question. He cleared his throat and spoke with the measured calm he'd learned as a leader. It's true that freedmen carry trauma. We must treat them with respect. The old unsullied training is not suitable for them. We propose an adapted program. Discipline and skill will be taught, but never with the brutality that once marked the unsullied. We wish to forge loyalty through pride, not fear. They'll be paid, recognized, eventually given ranks. This is the new legion's promise. The freedman dipped his head, relief flickering in his eyes. Then it shall be done. Meereen will send forth those who volunteer. We only ask that you respect their limits as they adapt to soldiering. Daenerys placed a hand over her heart. You have my word. None shall be brutalized in training. We will gather the best instructors from the unsullied ranks, those who understand discipline without cruelty, and from the new Valyrian officers who carry centuries of knowledge from their hidden enclaves. I only ask that these recruits bring dedication. Our battles may not be over. Varros leaned in, voice taking a deeper resonance. Indeed, we must also consider the future. The memory of the Night King taught us that unforeseen evils can rise. The Lord of Light's vision is rarely limited to mortal quarrels. If a new darkness stirs, be it from the east, from the seas, or even from powers unknown, we must be ready. Dragons alone cannot save us if we neglect unity and discipline. At the mention of the Night King, a chill seemed to enter the hall. The freedmen had not personally fought that terror, but many had heard the tales. Jon's face clouded with recollections of undead hordes, of that final confrontation at Winterfell, of the bitter cold that devoured entire armies. He spoke softly, mindful of the hush that overcame them. The war against the dead proved one thing: we must stand together or perish. These dragons, these legions, they're not just tools of conquest or liberation, but of survival. Let no one forget that. Old hatreds and divisions cost enough lives before. If we stand divided when the next great threat emerges, we might all be undone. A murmur of assent rippled through the council. Even those who had never set eyes on the undead recognized the truth in Jon's words. Daenerys offered him a faint, appreciative smile, recalling how he had once come to her seeking alliance against the White Walkers, how she'd believed in him, how, in that darkest hour, they had stood shoulder to shoulder against the tide of winter. Now, here they were, building an empire in the scorching desert. Life was full of contrasts. The morning wore on as they delved deeper into logistical matters. How many freedmen would be posted to each city, how to coordinate shipping lines for supplies, how to keep a communication network that spanned the entire bay. The tension softened into a practical, forward-looking mood, as though everyone recognized that the age of shackles had ended, replaced by the burdens of administration and progress. There were no illusions that it would be easy. Yet for every challenge they enumerated, the might of dragons and the discipline of the Legion offered a solution few could contest. At midday, the council broke for a short recess, unsullied servants bringing cold water and flatbread for the delegates. Daenerys stepped aside, finding a moment of privacy with Jon near a carved pillar depicting some old Giscari motif. She looked at him, studying the lines of conflict on his brow. Do you ever think of that night, Jon? At Winterfell, the darkness, the dead? How everything seemed so simple then. Fight or die, no politics, no conquered cities, no dragons but mine. Now it's all so different. He let out a quiet chuckle, though no mirth lit his eyes. I think of it often. Part of me longs for that clarity. No one doubted the evil we faced. Here, politics can twist even noble aims. But you're doing well, Daenerys. If anyone can carry the burden of forging a free Essos, it's you. Just remember the caution you taught me. Power must serve the people, not consume them. She reached out, briefly resting her hand on his arm, a gesture of shared trust. I try to heed that caution every day, but we both know how ambition can corrode even the best intentions. That's why I rely on you, Jon Snow, to call me back to reason if I stray. He nodded, reciprocating the sense of companionship. Then a motion from a herald beckoned them back to the council. Another freedman from Meereen waited to speak about farmland distribution. Daenerys sighed inwardly, slipping back into the role of queen, the conqueror who must now govern. The afternoon session crawled by, thick with details. Valyrian officers proposed scheduling hunts for dragons in the desert to keep them fed, ensuring they didn't ravage local livestock. Others debated the next step, whether to fortify the straits leading to the Gulf of Grief, blocking any potential interference from outside Essos. A few suggested exploring alliances with certain free cities that might prefer trade over conflict. Varos listened calmly, occasionally interjecting with references to visions he claimed the Lord of Light granted him. Visions of old Valyrian roads stretching from Astapor all the way to the eastern deserts, forging an unbroken empire. Some freedmen seemed awestruck, others uncertain, but no one dared dismiss him outright. As evening settled, the council concluded. Daenerys declared that the integration of Slavers Bay's population into the legions and freedmen's councils was the top priority, overshadowing any immediate thoughts of outward expansion. If other states in Essos wished to treat, they would find an open door. But if they clung to slavery or sought to undermine this new age, the dragons would not hesitate to remind them of their place. So ended another day in the forging of an empire. But the day was not truly ended. In the courtyard outside the palace, a warm desert twilight cast purple and gold streaks across the sky. Daenerys stood beneath a tall torch, watching as a small group of freedmen recruits underwent a final drill for the evening. Their posture was still unrefined, but the enthusiasm was real. Varos emerged from the shadows, silent as a whisper, to stand at her side. He carried a letter in his hand. She recognized the wax seal as belonging to a Braavosi merchant, though the letter was addressed to Varos personally. He read it quickly, his brow furrowing. "What news?" she asked, a hint of apprehension in her tone. "Some free cities watch with alarm," he murmured. "But Braavos remains neutral, Lys and Myr remain ambiguous. No sign of direct confrontation. They do mention an envoy from Robert Baratheon was seen in Pentos, as if verifying certain rumors. It seems the king in Westeros still tries to gauge our might or intentions." Daenerys set her jaw. "Let him watch. Our envoy should reach him soon, if it hasn't already. Perhaps there can be an accord, or at least an uneasy peace while we rebuild this continent. The last thing I want is another devastating war, especially after all we faced in the north." Varos lowered the parchment. "Lawless flames do not show me a certain war with Westeros. Many branches of fate remain. Our task here is to consolidate. Let us do so with speed, for the world rarely waits. The memory of the Night King taught us that unforeseen catastrophes can strike at any time." She recalled that catastrophic clash in the biting cold, a memory etched in her soul. "Yes," she said softly. "I only hope we do not create another catastrophe by forging an empire too large for men's hearts to handle." Varos offered a measured nod, his expression less intense for once. "That is where we rely on you, Daenerys. Your heart guides the moral compass of what we build. Mine ensures it is protected by flame. Jon stands between, bridging the old ways of Westeros and the new flames of Essos. Together, we might break the wheel without shattering the realm itself." Daenerys let those words sink in, the evening quiet broken only by the distant hiss of a dragon taking flight above the city. Then she stepped away, heading toward her chambers with a swirl of conflicting emotions. She thought of how once she was but a helpless girl in a foreign city, sold and traded. Now she reigned as a liberator, supported by the unstoppable might of old Valyria. It was a destiny that brought equal parts wonder and dread. The memory of the Night King, the bond with Jon, the looming question of Robert's next move, each formed a thread in a tapestry that bound her fate more tightly than ever. Across Astapor, freedmen settled into another evening of hope, forging new families, new identities. The clank of blacksmiths forging arms for the Legion continued even as darkness spread. Dragons soared in the star-speckled sky, their roars echoing across the desert. And in the hearts of men and women who had once endured chains, a new sense of belonging took root. No subtitles, no separate realms. Merely one story, woven from desert and flame, from old scars and new ambitions, from a past haunted by walking corpses to a present shaped by unstoppable living dragons. Jon looked up at the largest of them, Scourge, who circled with Drogon in the near distance, the two beasts that had once eyed each other warily now sharing the same winds. He let out a quiet sigh, uncertain whether to be relieved or fearful that they cooperated so well. In many ways, it symbolized the unification of two legacies: the Targaryen line, once the supreme house of Westeros, and Varos's hidden Valyrian enclaves, believed lost in the doom. If these dragons could coexist, perhaps the fractious cities of Essos, too, could find unity in a cause that surpassed old feuds. At least that was the hope Daenerys championed, the one that took root in the ashes of the slavers' downfall. That night, Daenerys convened a smaller, more intimate gathering in the same grand hall where the day's council had occurred. Only her closest advisors remained: Jon, Varos, a handful of Freedmen's Council representatives, the highest unsullied officer, and a pair of Dothraki leaders. Torches illuminated the darkness, and a map of Essos lay spread on a table, depicting with bright inks the routes from Astapor to Pentos, from Yunkai to Myr. The symbolism was inescapable. From one corner of the continent, they had begun forging a new empire that might stretch unopposed to the other side, unless the free cities formed a coalition or Westeros intervened. Daenerys stood at the map, her fingertips tracing lines along the coast. "We have ships, more than enough to secure our hold on the Gulf of Grief. If the free cities, say Pentos or Lys, wishes to open trade, we welcome them. If they support the slavers, we remind them that dragons remain ever watchful." Varos nodded, arms folded inside his crimson sleeves. "The freedmen legions will soon bolster our numbers further. Our existing Valyrian soldiers remain unmatched in discipline, but freedmen, trained with the right methods, can become a tidal wave of manpower, enough to reshape Essos entirely or to face any threat from across the sea." Jon set a candle near the edges of the map, revealing the narrow passage that led to Westeros. "We cannot deny that if Westeros sees us unify the entire continent, they may feel compelled to strike first, out of fear. We must keep channels open, reaffirming that we have no quarrel with them unless they bring it upon themselves." Daenerys nodded, recognizing the strategic sense in that. "Our envoy sails still. I only pray King Robert sees reason. Our earlier alliance at Winterfell, though uneasy, proved we can stand together against greater evils. Perhaps he recalls that." Varos, turning his gaze to the night sky through a high window, said quietly, "Greater evils remain in the world, hidden though they may be. The Lord of Light's flame warns me of shadows that lurk in corners unseen. The memory of the Night King is but one sign that life can never be complacent. We must remain strong, vigilant." A thoughtful hush enveloped the group. Each one present had faced death or tyranny in different forms. Dothraki outriders once roamed with savage freedom but now chose to help shepherd a new order. Freedmen had cast off chains to stand as equals. Jon had forsaken the simplistic loyalties of a bastardy in the north to champion Daenerys' cause. Varos carried the lore of an entire lost empire, harnessing faith in R'hllor to guide him. And Daenerys, mother of dragons, breaker of chains, dreamt of a world freed from cruelty, forging a path that might overshadow entire centuries of oppression. At last, Daenerys broke the silence with a gentle authority. "Tomorrow we commence the next phase of Legion training. Our scribes finalize the decrees for freedmen's councils in each city, ensuring accountability. Our watchers remain on alert for any sabotage. Once these tasks become routine, we can address the question of the free cities more directly. The day may come when we must insist they end slavery too, or face consequences. But that day is not now." Nods of agreement circled the room. The meeting dispersed, leaving each person to reflect on the swirling possibilities. Outside, the city slumbered beneath the guardianship of roving dragons. If there had once been nightmares of white walkers bringing eternal night, now a luminous, blazing future supplanted that dread. Yet the challenge of harnessing that blaze so it did not devour the realm remained a constant tension. Daenerys retired to her chambers, thinking of the small council's day-long reflections. They had touched upon everything. From new dragons to the old threat of the Night King, from the forging of freedmen's legions to the precarious balance with Westeros. In her dreams, she saw fleeting images. A tapestry of spires from Meereen, glowing dragons circling the black towers of old Valyria, waves of freedmen chanting her name, and the faint specter of a crowned stag standing on a rocky shore, uncertain whether to charge or turn away. She did not know if these dreams carried prophecy or mere anxiety. Yet the morning would bring renewed demands, and she would face them with the steel of a queen who had learned to bear burdens that might break lesser rulers. Far above the sleeping city, Drogon soared in lazy circuits, occasionally encountering scourge or maelstrom, their roars echoing across the desert. The unnatural harmony among these living flames was its own symbol. That once scattered embers of an ancient civilization had coalesced into a forging fire, shaped by the will of Daenerys Targaryen, by the sorcery of Varos, by the loyalty of freedmen, and by the memory of a world almost consumed by ice. No subtitles, no divisions. Merely the single, ongoing tapestry of fate, weaving from the corners of the north to the heart of Essos. Thus, the nighttime hush brought a temporary reprieve. But the story's momentum would not abate, for each dawn carried the potential of new letters from Westeros, new alliances or conflicts with the free cities, new breakthroughs in forging an unstoppable legion, and the lingering question: did the new Valyria truly herald an age of liberation, or a conflagration yet unseen? For now, Daenerys and her whole council, gathered in Astapor, reflected on how far they had come and steeled themselves for the trials still to be faced. And in that reflection, the seeds of tomorrow's decisions lay, awaiting the next turn of the wheel, this time, a wheel they intended, by dragons and steel, to finally break.